The whispers began quietly, barely audible outside the circles of academic journals and obscure economic columns in the Japanese press. At first, they were nothing more than speculative murmurs, hesitant mentions in regional think tank reports, anonymous sources hinting from behind the veils of Tokyo's diplomatic corridors. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, those whispers grew louder. Then came the headlines. Major publications, from Nikkei to the South China Morning Post, began to speak the unthinkable out loud. Japan is seriously weighing the prospect of joining BRICS. What was once the domain of geopolitical fantasy is now emerging as a very real possibility. When outlets like the Financial Times and The Economist begin citing sources within Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this is no longer rumor. It is revelation. And not just any revelation, but one with seismic implications. Because Japan isn't just any country. It is a pillar of the post-war world order, a loyal cornerstone of American influence in the Pacific, and one of Washington's most dependable allies. Now, suddenly, it is entertaining the idea of stepping into the orbit of BRICS, a bloc the United States openly labels a threat to the international system it helped build. This is not a diplomatic gesture. It's a rupture. A shift so profound it could redraw the strategic map of the 21st century. The roots of this transformation trace back to a familiar figure. With Donald Trump's return to the White House came a renewed surge of economic nationalism. In March, the president reignited a tariff war, this time with Japan directly in the crosshairs. Duties were slapped on Japanese automobiles, the pride of the nation's industrial might. Companies like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, long symbols of Japanese engineering prowess, found themselves penalized overnight. The American market, which had reliably absorbed nearly a third of Japan's car exports, suddenly became hostile territory, barricaded behind a wall of tariffs. But it didn't stop there. The penalties expanded, hitting Japanese electronics, high-tech components, and finally agriculture. New quotas were imposed on seafood exports, tuna, squid, shellfish. America must come first, Trump proclaimed on Truth Social. And then the words that sent a chill through Tokyo's political class. Even allies can't exploit our generosity forever. In Japan, these statements landed not as policy, but as betrayal. In the halls of the Diet, in the back rooms of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the questions turned bitter. If Japan was no longer seen as a trusted partner of the United States, then what exactly was the alliance worth? Sensing an opening, Beijing and Moscow moved with precision. Chinese delegations began arriving in Tokyo more frequently, their tone collaborative, their proposals expansive. Quiet backchannels buzzed with possibilities. Then, in April, a secret meeting reportedly took place in Shanghai. According to Bloomberg, the gathering included officials and business leaders from both sides. The agenda, integrating Japan into the BRICS economic framework. The discussions were bold, settling trade in Yuan and rubles, developing joint technology hubs, energy partnerships, even connecting Japanese banks to BRICS' evolving alternative payment systems. What started as a conversation about observer status quickly escalated. And now, if reports in Nikkei are accurate, full membership is not only possible, it is actively being considered. If realized, it would be nothing short of historic. A founding member of the G7, a nation whose post-war identity has been interwoven with American influence, now contemplating a pivot to the global south. And yet the economic momentum seems to support the logic. Trade between Japan and BRICS countries is booming. In just 6 months, exports to China have climbed 14%, to India by 21%, and to Brazil by 18%, according to Japan's Ministry of Economy. It is happening faster than anyone anticipated. A shift once considered unthinkable now feels inevitable. The question is no longer if Japan is thinking about BRICS. It's how far down that road they've already gone, and whether there's still a path back. Japanese corporations are quietly reshaping the country's global alliances, moving away from traditional Western economic dependencies and exploring new strategic partnerships, particularly in the resource-rich regions of the global south. In South Africa, major Japanese firms have begun collaborating on platinum and lithium mining projects, resources critical to the future of clean energy and technology. Simultaneously, and despite enduring international sanctions, Russia continues to channel energy exports into Japan through intermediaries, maintaining a steady flow of resources that further sidesteps Western control. What's most striking, however, is that these deals are increasingly being transacted not in US dollars, but in alternative currencies such as China's Yuan and India's rupee, an unmistakable sign of a shifting global monetary landscape. This deviation from dollar-dominated trade has not gone unnoticed in Washington. Reuters recently confirmed that segments of these Japanese contracts have already transitioned to non-dollar settlements, sparking alarm within the U.S. administration. The White House press secretary openly voiced concern that trusted allies may be drifting toward anti-American economic platforms, subtly eroding decades of U.S.-led financial hegemony. Former President Donald Trump took to social media with characteristic bluntness, warning that if Japan dares to follow the path laid out by BRICS, its economy will face collapse and its exports will become worthless in the global market. His tone was not one of negotiation but of threat, yet in Tokyo the reaction was less one of fear and more of resolution. On the ground, Japanese multinational corporations are no longer waiting for permission to adapt to the emerging world order. They are already doing so. Mitsubishi has entered into a memorandum of cooperation with India's Tata Group, laying the foundation for joint industrial ventures. Sony is weighing collaborative manufacturing arrangements with Chinese partners. Panasonic, in a historic move, announced it will begin settling transactions directly with Brazil in reals, completely bypassing the US dollar. These aren't isolated decisions. They form a broader, deliberate pattern of economic realignment. According to sources cited by the Wall Street Journal, Japan's ruling elite is now deeply divided over this changing course. Some factions, particularly within the military establishment, worry that drifting too far from the United States could compromise national security and weaken long-standing defense agreements. Others, especially among the business community and segments of parliament, believe that clinging to old alliances is a risk Japan can no longer afford. One senior official reportedly stated behind closed doors that the country has spent too long living in Washington's shadow, and that the time has come to pursue a more independent and Asia-oriented policy direction. Analysts are beginning to describe the shift as historic. For the first time in decades, Japan is openly exploring frameworks that challenge the supremacy of the dollar and question the permanence of Western-led institutions. Tokyo has shown genuine interest in the digital yuan, signaled openness to discussions with the BRICS Development Bank, and accelerated direct trade arrangements with India and Brazil. These steps, once politically unthinkable, are now materializing quickly and decisively. The implications extend far beyond economics. Should Japan formally align itself with the BRICS bloc, it would not merely disrupt trade flows or currency markets. It would symbolically and strategically fracture the post-war Western alliance system. The Economist has already warned that such a realignment would constitute the most serious blow to Western unity since the end of World War II. For the United States, the consequences could be nothing short of catastrophic. Losing its most important ally in Asia would undermine its influence over critical sea lanes, shipping routes, and the broader balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. For China, however, it would represent an unprecedented diplomatic victory, proof that the old order is fading and a multipolar world is finally taking shape. What's perhaps most troubling for policymakers in Washington is that this transformation is not being driven solely by government decisions or corporate strategy, but by changes within Japanese society itself. A recent poll conducted by the Asahi Shimbun found that, for the first time in over 30 years, public trust in the United States among Japanese citizens has fallen below 50%. At the same time, a full 62% of respondents expressed support for strengthening cooperation with other Asian countries, including India and China. These numbers reveal a quiet but powerful undercurrent of change, a generational shift away from the West and toward the East. Japan's younger population, in particular, increasingly sees China and India not as rivals, but as innovators and economic powerhouses. To them, the future lies in Asia's rising tech sectors, growing consumer markets, and collaborative energy. Universities across Japan are already in talks to launch joint educational programs with institutions in China and India, while leading business schools have begun offering courses and lectures focused on navigating the BRICS economic system. The idea that success can only be achieved through alignment with the West is no longer taken for granted. It is being openly questioned, and in many quarters quietly rejected. Major global publications have taken note. In its July report, the Financial Times described Japan's possible entry into BRICS as a turning point that would mark the end of the Pax Americana in Asia. Nikkei has written that Japanese corporations no longer see the American market as stable or reliable, and are therefore building long-term strategies anchored in deeper ties with India and China. Bloomberg, citing sources within Japan's Ministry of Finance, has reported that the first agreements on trial settlements using yuan and rupees between Japanese and Asian banks could be signed imminently. This seismic shift has also reverberated across the broader U.S. alliance network. In Seoul, government officials have stated they cannot envision a functioning regional security architecture without Japan firmly inside the American orbit. In Canberra, the Sydney Morning Herald called Japan's potential accession to BRICS nothing less than a geopolitical earthquake. Even in Europe, where G7 cohesion was long taken for granted, Analysts are now openly asking whether the West can maintain its economic and strategic influence if Tokyo steps out of line. Inside Japan, not all voices are in favor of this new course. Certain military circles and conservative political figures caution that moving too far toward BRICS could compromise Japan's security umbrella under the US-Japan alliance. But even they acknowledge that economic realities are pushing the country in a different direction. If US tariffs and economic pressure continue, and if Washington refuses to adapt to new global dynamics, then Japan's pivot toward Asia may become irreversible. No amount of diplomatic rhetoric or defense agreements will be able to counteract the gravitational pull of trade, innovation, and financial necessity. Ironically, it is Trump's own hardline policies, designed to rein in allies and force economic compliance, that have catalyzed this transformation. The more Washington tightens its grip, the faster Japan appears to be slipping through its fingers. Experts across the political spectrum now agree. Unless the United States fundamentally rethinks its approach to global leadership, it risks triggering the very outcomes it seeks to prevent. And so, as autumn approaches, the world may be standing on the brink of a geopolitical milestone. Japan's formal announcement of its intent to join BRICS would no longer be a symbolic gesture. It would be a geopolitical shockwave, signaling the end of a chapter in global history and the start of a new multipolar era. If and when that declaration comes, the world map, both economically and strategically, will be redrawn, and nothing will ever be the same again.